Wind hammered the ship so hard that the deck felt like it was flexing under their boots. It was still dark on the morning of December 26, 1969, when the SS Badger State rolled again, harder this time, her bow knifing into a North Pacific swell and throwing a sheet of icy water over the men working aft. Below them, in hold number 5, you could hear it, the sickening metallic thud of loose bombs slamming into steel. Every impact made the hull shiver. Men stopped for a heartbeat each time, listening, waiting to see if that particular hit would be the last thing they ever heard. They were merchant mariners, not combat soldiers, but they were sitting on as much high explosive as a small air war. Nearly 9,000 bombs, rockets, artillery shells, and mines were stacked in the holds, bound for U.S. forces in Vietnam. The Badger State, a 441-foot World War II-era transport now working under charter to the Military Sea Transportation Service, had sailed from the Bangor Naval Weapons Station in Washington a couple of weeks earlier, loaded down to her marks, and pointed west across the Pacific. The mission was simple on paper: haul the ordnance to Da Nang and go home. From the start, things had felt off. While they were still near the U.S. coast, the crew noticed problems with the steering gear, hydraulic fluid leaks that made the rudder sluggish and forced constant attention down in the steering flat. As they pushed deeper into the North Pacific, the weather turned ugly. Around December 17th, the Badger State ran into a winter storm, with winds climbing, seas building, and the ship beginning to roll in long, heavy arcs that made dishes slide, doors slam, and stomachs heave. Rolling was bad enough on a normal freighter. On a ship loaded with bombs, it was terrifying. The munitions were supposed to be secured in wooden cradles, steel bands, and dunnage. In calm seas, that might have been enough. In this storm, it wasn't. With each roll, pallets shifted a little more. Straps creaked, blocks splintered. Somewhere below, a pallet finally gave way, and the first bombs broke loose. The men who went down into the holds to try to secure them stepped into a nightmare. Bomb casings the size of oil drums were sliding and crashing in the semi-darkness, leaving red-brown streaks of rust on the steel as they hit bulkheads and the inner skin of the hull. The crew improvised anything they could find: mattresses, spare hatchboards, mooring lines, even frozen sides of meat from the stores, to wedge between the bombs and slow their movement. They stacked furniture, jammed life jackets into gaps, and nailed down whatever they could reach while the ship rolled 30, 40, 50 degrees to each side. They barely slept. Watches blurred together as the storm refused to ease. Captain Charles T. Wilson kept trying different courses and speeds, trying to find a heading that would reduce the roll without turning the ship broadside to the seas. None of it worked for long. Every time they thought they had the cargo blocked, another heavy roll would rip the makeshift bracing apart. Bombs punched dents in the inner hull, and in places even broke through, letting seawater seep in. By Christmas Day, the crew was exhausted and scared in a way most of them had never admitted feeling before. They knew exactly what they were carrying. They knew that if even one large bomb detonated properly, there would be no lifeboats, no distress calls, no rescue. Still, they kept going into the holds with wedges and lines, working in freezing air that tasted of rust and cordite, because the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. Just after dawn on December 26th, the storm still hadn't let go. Seas were running over 20 feet, with winds above 40 knots. The Badger State rolled again, harder than before. Some men swore later that she went past 50 degrees, far enough that it felt like she might not come back. Down in hold number 5, a cluster of 2,000-pound bombs broke loose as a unit and slammed across the compartment. One of them struck just right, against steel that had already been battered and thinned. The blast ripped through the stern of the ship. It wasn't a full-scale chain reaction, but it didn't have to be. The explosion blew a hole about 12 by 8 feet in the starboard side near the after end and sent flame and smoke roaring up from below. Men on deck were knocked off their feet. Others felt the shock wave in their chests before they even heard the roar. For a few awful seconds, no one knew if more bombs were about to follow. Wilson didn't wait to find out. He ordered a distress signal sent, reporting that the cargo had exploded and the ship was on fire in the middle of the North Pacific, roughly midway between the West Coast and Japan. The Greek freighter Kian Star picked up the call and altered course, fighting its own way through the same brutal seas to reach them. On the Badger State, the captain tried to buy time, changing course, slowing, anything to keep the flames away from the other holds long enough for help to arrive. The crew tried to launch inflatable life rafts, but the wind simply tore them away or flipped them. One by one, their options vanished. They had 2 conventional lifeboats left that were usable. One had already been damaged in the storm. That left a single wooden lifeboat as the only real escape, and 40 men still aboard. Wilson knew someone had to stay with the ship to handle the radio and try to keep her head into the seas. He chose 4 volunteers to remain with him. The other 35 men, nearly the entire crew, were ordered into that one lifeboat, crowding shoulder to shoulder in heavy, waterlogged clothing and life jackets as the davits creaked and the boat lowered toward the surging gray water. The lifeboat hit the sea in one piece, a small miracle in itself. For a moment, it seemed like the worst might be over. The men pulled at the oars, trying to get clear of the burning stern as the Badger State labored in the background, smoke pouring out against the low sky. Then the ocean delivered one more cruel turn. Inside hold number 5, where the first bomb had detonated, the makeshift bracing was gone. Another 2,000-pound bomb, already loose, rolled across the sloping deck toward the starboard side. The earlier explosion had left a jagged hole in the hull just above the waterline. The bomb reached it, hit the edge, and kept going, sliding right out of the ship. It dropped almost directly onto the crowded lifeboat. The impact didn't set it off, but it didn't have to. The bomb smashed into the boat's side and flipped it in an instant. Men who had survived days of terror aboard the freighter suddenly found themselves thrown into 48-degree water, struggling in heavy seas, their lifeboat shattered beneath them. Some never even got their heads above the surface again. By the time the Kian Star reached the scene, the Pacific was dotted with individual heads and arms instead of a single boat. The Greek crew fought to haul survivors up with lines and nets, leaning over lifelines while waves washed across their own decks. Sailors rose toward them on the crest of a swell, were almost within reach, and then vanished again as the ship dropped into the next trough. They pulled men aboard upside down, wrapped in lines, half-conscious or not breathing at all. Back on the Badger State, the fire was spreading, and secondary explosions were starting to pop somewhere below. Wilson and the 4 men who had stayed with him finally had no choice. They sent a last message, then climbed over the side and jumped, aiming themselves toward the Kian Star's lights in the distance. 5 went into the water. Only 3, including the captain, would survive the swim. When it was over, the Kian Star had pulled 14 men out of the Pacific. They were hypothermic, burned, battered, and stunned, but alive. The rest of the 40-man crew never came home. Some sources would later list 26 dead, others a slightly higher toll, but everyone agreed on the number of survivors pulled from the water that night. 14 men, saved only because another ship had been close enough and willing enough to fight its way into the blast zone. The Badger State herself did not go down right away. Abandoned and powerless, she drifted for days, burning from the stern forward while the cargo in her remaining holds periodically detonated. U.S. Navy vessels eventually reached the area and considered whether anything could be salvaged, but the continuing explosions made it clear she could never be towed safely. She was a floating minefield, a danger to any ship that happened across her track. On January 5, 1970, as a fleet tug closed in with orders to finish her with gunfire, the Badger State made the decision for everyone. The hull, weakened by fire and blasts and winter seas, finally broke. The ship slipped beneath the surface of the North Pacific, taking the remaining bombs and the unanswered questions about every small decision made during those 9 days of struggle down with her. For the families of the lost mariners, the story ended with telegrams and official words about explosions, storms, and heroic efforts. For the survivors, it never really ended at all. They carried the memory of that cargo hold, the roll of the ship, and the sight of comrades disappearing into cold water for the rest of their lives. And somewhere on the seafloor, far from any coastline, lie the scattered remains of a freighter that became a floating bomb and a reminder of how thin the line can be between routine duty and catastrophe at sea. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.